Historically, people around the world lived in villages like this. When you live in a village, you step out of a home and most likely you will see a familiar face. When you live in a city, you step out of a home and you will see a stranger's face. For the first time in human history, man can meet and chat with strangers all day long right there in their bedroom. This is changing the way we relate to the world, and this is changing our understanding of community.
Today, the web of interactions among people all around the world is much higher than it ever was before. People have direct communications, direct trade across all kinds of borders. And the real issue is that governments can no longer think of themselves. They're really only one part of the overall system. It's not a series of states and then the people are under them. It's the state plays a role in the whole thing, but individual people have a much bigger role than ever before. And that's just going to accelerate, just going to continue. And you know, in many places, the questions of language come into play, questions of geography come into play, and those kinds of relationships may become more influential in many cases than some faraway government agents depending on where you are. So yeah, I think the world is changing in a lot of interesting ways.
The world is indeed changing. Our lives are increasingly a function of what happens in other countries. Financial engineering in the United States determines growth and employment in many parts of the world. Carbon dioxide emissions from China ends up determining crop yields and livelihoods in Bangladesh. Or a nuclear leak in Japan, or an epidemic from Vietnam ends up determining public health in many parts of the world. This is a new state of affairs. This level of interdependence is unprecedented. And we need a map and a compass to help us navigate this new and interdependent world. Now think about the way we drive. Every day, millions of people get into their cars and drive at 50 or 100 kilometers an hour. One wrong move in the steering wheel and everything can end badly. But we drive carefree because we have a reasonable expectation about the way that other drivers would behave. If anything can happen anytime, we couldn't drive the way we do right now. We would drive far more slowly, far more cautiously. We have some expectation of the way that other drivers would behave because we have long established rules, conventions, habits. It is that mental framework that put our mind at ease. In an increasingly interdependent world, we need a comparable mental framework. And a key part of that mental framework would be global civics. Responsibilities that we take on and rights that we are ready to claim.
This film was made by 9 volunteer international teams who want to capture the responses of individuals from around the world to that change. In this film, you will hear voices of ordinary citizens from very different educational, occupational, cultural, and religious backgrounds. They are all addressing one question: how are we going to cope with a changing world like ours?
There is a saying, Umuntu, Ngumuntu, Ngabantu, which expresses the idea of Ubuntu very well. That means a person is a person by means of other persons. And I suppose the attitude that I'm talking about is the ability to see yourself in others and to recognize that what you are is in their gift.
Because of the advancement of technology, that we are all coming so close, I think it is essential that we don't consider ourselves just as a citizen of one country, but as a citizen of this whole world. Because whatever problems will be faced by us will be faced by whole world together. And with the sort of relationships that we have with the other countries right now, generally, it is essential for us to consider ourselves as a global citizen.
站在儒家的立场上呢，他有一种天下意识。中国古人有一句话叫做“天下兴亡，匹夫有责”。那么这个天下呢，在现在的这个视野的理解下，应该就包括这个地球，整个人类都可以理解为天下，普天之下。那么普天之下，所有的人，他们的喜怒哀乐，我觉得跟我们每一个人都是息息相关的。肯定是每一个人的喜怒哀乐，对于我们个体来说，都是有责任的。如果往深处说一点的话呢，叫天人感应，天人合一，不仅和人有关系，和整个世界、整个天地都是息息相应的，它是一个整个的生命体。在这个角度来理解的话，肯定是我们每一个人都是这个大生命的一份子，一个部分。
I think people everywhere, every human being has responsibility for every human being. Now, a question is whether we feel that responsibility or whether we assume that responsibility. And I suppose the important question is, how do we assume concretely a responsibility in a world that is too big for any of us to take care of? And so there are judgments to be made in terms of what can I actually do, rather than simply assuming that the responsibility is infinite. Potentially, yes, we have a responsibility for each other, but concretely we have to find ways in which each one of us can exercise that responsibility to any person that we may find that we ought to engage with and help.
Dünyanın farklı yerlerinde yaşayan insanlara karşı sorumluluk hissediyor musunuz?
Hayır.
Neden? Neden?
Biraz daha yaklaşın. Neden? Ben önce kendimden sorumluyum. Yaşadığım ortamı biliyorsunuz zaten. Benim hiçbir sorunun cevabını benim için hayır.
Peki yabancı ülkelerdeki insanların size karşı bir sorumluluğu olduğunu düşünüyor musunuz?
Hayır, düşünmüyorum. Herkes kendinden sorumlu. Aynı onlar da benim gibi düşündüğünü zannediyorum.
Look after your family and forget about the rest. Because nobody will care about you. Nobody.
My opinion is that we should actually be worrying what is happening in other parts of the world, because why it could be on your doorstep. It could be happening to you tomorrow. You see, because why what is for you like yesterday can be for me tomorrow, you see. So we should really check it out. Globally, we should check it out.
The way in which we conceptualize ourselves is very much defined by the groups to which we belong. So when the sports team that we really like has a victory, then we sort of bask in the glory of that. Or if there's a loved one that we know that's suffering from a sickness, then we feel bad. And so the way in which we understand our own self-esteem is very much tied up with other people. That exists. Sort of our moral intuitions and tendencies exist, but the self is really nothing without the other. And it's largely defined, in relation to other people around us. And so that's interesting from a global civics perspective, because the way in which you sort of conceptualize your role in groups, you know, both locally and globally, very much plays into the way in which you see your obligations to other people.
Acho que tem parte.
Responsabilidade.
É. Porque tão longe assim, eu acho que é difícil, né? Resolver, por exemplo, eu acho que é preciso que todos se unam e que tenha um governo bom que é quem tem os meios e que pode mudar essa coisa, né? Porque uma pessoa só não faz nada, né?
No es el sentimiento más fuerte, el sentimiento más fuerte obviamente es para con la gente de mi país, pero sí, yo creo que ya a esta altura con lo que es el mundo necesitamos todos colaborar y cooperar con todos. Básicamente regionalmente, obviamente, ya que estamos todos separados globalmente como regiones, pero sí, yo creo que todos tenemos una responsabilidad con gente de otro país también.
Acho que o que acontece fora do Brasil, fora da nossa região, a gente deve se importar sim, deve tomar conhecimento dessas coisas, mas procurar sempre ajudar quem está mais próximo da gente, né? Porque não adianta você ajudar uma pessoa que está lá fora e uma pessoa do seu lado e não está recebendo essa ajuda. Então é mais fácil você primeiro começar a ajudar os que estão ao seu alcance, mais próximos de você, e depois você ajudar o próximo, que está mais distante.
像从人道来说，这个发生这些灾难是对人是不好的，所以我觉得就是如果你作为一个中国人或者是世界上任何一个国家的人，能够尽到一份力量去帮助他们，这个是从人道方面来说都是好的。从政治经济方面来说，我觉得也是影响很大，应该 去有所作为，有所去关注。经济方面来说的话，也应该。为什么现在经济全球一体化？当一个国家如果灾难太多的话，它的经济必然不会好，人民的生活不好，消费也会影响。同样对我们比如说远在中国的企业啊，一些其他的经济领域啊，都会受到很大的影响。这个就是说，如果能够 我是觉得，就是说，如果能够的话，都是应该去帮助和干预的。
Enlightened self-interest is, of course, a very important driver of international cooperation. Particularly, nation-states will pursue their national interests, and that's normal, and hopefully in an enlightened way. But beyond that, I think a sense of global civics, of belonging to a global community, is increasingly necessary in the world. Otherwise, the transaction costs, the difficulties of reaching solutions just based on self-interested negotiations are going to take too much time, and the solution of the problems will be too difficult.
Dünyanın her yerindeki insanlara karşı sorumluluklarımız olduğunu düşünüyorum. Öyle bir dönemde yaşıyoruz ki artık her şeyin birbirini nasıl etkilediğini insanlar çok açık bir şekilde görüyorlar. Dünyanın herhangi bir yerindeki bir olaydan hepimiz etkileniyoruz ve bu bilinç giderek hepimizde yerleşiyor. Belki eskiden bu kadar değildi, daha izoleydik, daha küçük çevrelerde yaşadığımızı zannediyorduk. Dünyadaki olaylardan ne kadar etkilendiğimizin farkında değildik ama özellikle son 20 yılda belki giderek artan biçimde bu bilinç insanlar arasında yayılıyor. Dolayısıyla herkese karşı sorumluluğumuz var. Bu tabii sadece bir insani, vicdani duygu değil. Bu aynı zamanda kendi çıkarımızı, kendi yararımızla ilgilendiren bir düşünce biçimi. Çünkü biliyoruz ki biz dünyayı, insanları, dünyada yaşayan toplumları bir bütün olarak görmezsek bizim sonumuz iyi olmayacak. İnsanlığın geleceği iyi olmayacak. Ancak hepimizin birbirimizi etkilediğimizin bilincine varırsak ve birbirimiz için sorumluluk duyarsak dünyanın daha iyi bir geleceğe yönelmesini sağlayabileceğiz.
Actually, the message is very simple. I will just reproduce from the ancient Indian culture. It says that look at the world as one family. Okay, and in the context of our discussion, I would say that let us not look at the whole world as one market. Okay, even though our business pressures do normally, compel us to look at the world as one market. But the day we stop looking at the world as one market, and the day we truly begin to look at the world as one family, all the problems which are so far appearing to be unsurmountable can start getting, at least finding some solutions on the horizons within our own lifespans. So I think world as one family is the message that I would like to reiterate.
One cannot jump from the family to the world as if it was easy. I think if we push that too hard, if we argue that the whole world is just one family, we will not be successful. We will not convince people. We have to acknowledge the importance of proximity, of cultural ties, of language, of habit, in forming this solidarity. But I think we have to extend the circle, and we have to encourage and build on more global dialogues. As communication technology allows this, it may become easier. So I think without being too ambitious, we have to be courageous.
Jesus once was asked by a person, "Who is my neighbor?" in response to the command that we read in the Christian holy book, the Bible, that we should love God and love neighbors. And in response, Jesus told a story, and the gist of that story is that a neighbor is any person, no matter how close or how far from me, who is in need, whether my kin, whether my co-religionists, whether my I have some interest in that person's life, personal interest in that person's life, that person is my neighbor. Therefore, a person in Germany, a person in Ethiopia is my neighbor, and especially if that neighbor is in need, he or she has a claim on me. I have a responsibility to that person.
Creo que sí, que es recíproco. Al tener yo con ellos, ellos conmigo deberían tener la misma.
Yes, we ought to have. Naturally, we ought to have. If others should have a certain responsibility or awareness about what is happening in India, then we too must respond. And yes, we should be more aware that, presently let's say we are aware. So let's say we should be more aware and more proactive and more interactive with the outside world.
I think there's something very valuable about taking a cross-cultural approach. From my own experience, I grew up partially in Bolivia in an indigenous community outside of La Paz. It was with the Aymara Indians, and their conception of their political and social structures were very much embedded in the sense of reciprocity. So one's freedom is really actualized in the collective. And I think there's something very valuable to be learned from their kind of philosophical orientation. And so I think that by exploring various other cultures and their ideologies, it's very important to global civics that we bring these understandings together. And that in turn, I think, will more smoothly create a dialogue and a set of universal truths that can be shared cross-culturally and a way of interacting with one another around these issues.
Eu acho que numa escala global é possível que as pessoas se mobilizem em função de grupos que estão passando por algum sofrimento, por alguma situação mais difícil, que estão necessitando de ajuda, mas eu não acredito em mobilizações muito grandiosas, eu acredito mais nas mobilizações locais, né? Claro, com intercâmbio, mas com maior enfoque nas comunidades próximas, assim, né? Isso assim, e tudo simultaneamente. Aí o global seria nesse sentido temporal, né? Ao mesmo tempo acontecendo em vários lugares diferentes, vários pequenos grupos trabalhando no mesmo sentido, numa mesma direção.
Dalla globalizzazione a tutto quello che comporta la globalizzazione è chiaro che poi si arriva a capire che esistono dei significati intrinseci alla civiltà globale, forse la tendenza all'empatia, un discorso di colleganza e di solidarietà. La civiltà globale è il dialogo interreligioso. Noi qui come prefettura lo abbiamo avviato come tavolo, un tavolo interreligioso con le forze religiose che sono presenti nella città di Napoli. E forse dal dialogo si capisce che sono più le cose che uniscono che quelle che dividono, però il percorso è sicuramente molto più lungo di quello che possiamo pensare quando parliamo di civiltà globale.
I don't think there's any doubt that we all have responsibilities towards one another. At the same time, there's no question that people in developing nations have greater needs, and therefore we have greater responsibilities towards them.
Questo processo, anche qui direi che al di là dei livelli di coscienza e di consapevolezza, io ho la convinzione che sia venuto sempre più crescendo quest'idea che apparteniamo a una stessa comunità e fondamentalmente siamo legati a uno stesso destino. E credo che anche tutti i processi di immigrazione, anche con aspetti che sono terribili, tragici, ci fanno capire sempre di più che noi non possiamo pensare, e soprattutto penso a questa parte del mondo che risulta privilegiata rispetto al resto, che noi possiamo salvaguardare le nostre condizioni di vita ignorando come vive il resto dell'umanità o quelli che sono in condizioni.
Sí, evidentemente, bueno, yo voy a responder desde mi fe y desde la fe que profeso y también como ser humano, ¿no? Desde ambos puntos de vista, me parece que todos tenemos un vínculo por ser todos seres humanos. Desde la fe también les puedo decir que desde mi fe todos creemos que todos hemos sido creados por el mismo Dios. Y ya desde ese punto de vista, todos estamos vinculados y tenemos que estar vinculados unos a otros. Es la misma dignidad humana la que nos iguala y que por eso tenemos que respetarnos mutuamente y buscar el bien común no solamente entre los países, sino también mundialmente.
İnsan olmak itibariyle bütün insanlara karşı, hatta sadece insanlara karşı, tüm canlılara karşı ve tüm evrene karşı insan olmak itibariyle sorumluluğumuz var. Benim de içinde yer aldığım, inandığım İslami tasavvufi görüşe göre ki Hz. Mevlana'nın, Celaleddin Rumi'nin bir sözüdür. Beni Adem haza yekdigerent der. İnsanoğlu birbirinin uzvu gibidir. İnsanın nasıl ki bir organı hastalanırsa ve ağrırsa, diğer organlar bundan etkilenirse, yeryüzündeki bir insan da, hatta bir canlı da muzdarip olduğunda, rahatsız olduğunda kendini insan varsayan, insan olduğunu hisseden herkes bunu paylaşması lazım. Bu felsefeye göre, bu düşünceye göre. Ne var ki birçoğumuzun taşıdığı etnik, dini aidiyetler, kimlikler, daha doğrusu bu aidiyetleri fazlaca önemsiyor olmamız, fazlaca insan olma ortak paydasını önüne getirmemiz, bu acıları hissetmemizin önünde önemli bir engeldir.
Eine objektive Verpflichtung wäre, wenn ich in einem Vertragsbündnis bin und dort sozusagen festgeschrieben ist, dass ich in bestimmten Situationen helfen muss. Und eine moralische Verpflichtung wäre eben, wenn diese objektive Verpflichtung nicht besteht, sozusagen helfe ich oder nicht. Wo ich mir selber als Staat oder als Person die Frage stelle, sollte ich es tun oder nicht. Und es dann eben tue oder nicht. Und da bin ich der Meinung, da gilt für jeden Einzelnen eher das Gebot.
我觉得首先，包括中国在内的这些国家哈，首先有一个全球化的教育很重要的。中国既是全球化的这个受益者，也是全球化的某些方面的受害者。所以说，我们必须把这个全球化这个东西呢，跟这个小孩子说得非常清楚。现在很多，包括我们现在中国的很多这个课本了哈，很奇怪。 中小学这一块的东西，对全球化教育好像就是一种很简单的，可能就是就是很不到位的一些东西。当然，我觉得在内容方面也可以革新一下，比如说，是不是联合国可以设计一套教材出来，这样的公民教育的教材，它是大家普遍认可的一些这个东西，可以做出来。 联合国可以做出来，你不然的话，你总是说西方为主，或者以东方为主，我觉得或者以中国为主，或者是伊斯兰世界，我觉得都不是那个，大家应该坐下来，就是说民主的去确认这些东西。
There are a lot of common features to the views we have received from around the world. First of all, there are a lot of thoughtful people who grapple with these issues. I'm exhilarated to hear from them. Then there is a lot of focus on reciprocity. It seems like people are ready to take on responsibilities. They also want a world where other people take on similar responsibilities. This attention to reciprocity reminds me of the ultimatum game. This is a game where one person receives $100 and has to offer a split to a second person. The second person has no say on what the split should be, but he can either say yes and no. If he says yes to the split, they both go home with their share of the money. If he says no, neither of them get anything. Now, this game has been played in different parts of the world for many years, so we have a good sense of how people behave. Most people offer the second person $45, $50. That's interesting because at least theoretically they can offer the second person only $1 and keep $99, right? Because the second person would be foolish to reject that $1 because that's better than nothing. But that's not what happens. Routinely, people in the second position reject offers worse than $25. So they're willing to forego $25 for the sake of upholding fairness. Humanity seems ready to pay a price to defend fairness. And that may be the very basis of a global civics. We need to talk to each other, we need to engage each other, to find a global civics that we can all agree on. But I would say the ingredients for this conversation exist in all parts of the world, and that's good news.
氧化碳可能应该受到限制。按照这种大多数80%以上科学家的说法，这个全球气候变暖那是一个不争的事实，而且在2020年左右它这是一个可能是个不可逆转的一个转折点，所以现在如果人类这一块也做的事情呢，可能是延缓这种地球变暖的进程，这是必须做的。
I think what's happening relating to climate in most of the world is also a source of hope. I think people from all over the world, from China to the US, from Turkey to Sweden, from Japan to Brazil, are concerned about climate and the continuity of our planet. So these things give hope and create a sense of global belonging and global civics that is encouraging.
A mente assim, das pessoas são sempre iguais, entendeu? O pensamento das pessoas em relação a isso, a problemas ambientais, acho que as pessoas sempre pensam bastante nisso, mas o negócio acho que falta mais é conscientização mesmo, para que elas possam não só pensar e agir também, entendeu? Porque ela vê uma propaganda ali, se emociona e tal, mas acaba não fazendo aquilo que é falado, entendeu? Aquilo que a propaganda tenta te mostrar. Eu acho que tem que ter mais esse negócio de ir lá conscientizar as pessoas e para fazer realmente aquele trabalho acontecer, entendeu? Não só propagandinha ali, chegar até mesmo mostrar à pessoa que esse trabalho pode trazer um retorno para ela, tanto financeiro quanto de saúde também, né? Que aí ela vai poder respirar muito melhor e pode ganhar uma graninha também.
Her şeyden önce insanoğlunun doyma bilmeyen, hırsına gem vurması yeryüzündeki birçok felaketin önünü kapatabilir diye düşünüyorum. İnsanoğlunun tüketim hırsına bağlı olarak yeryüzü, atmosfer daha ziyade kirlenmekte. Buna karşı ferdi sorumluluğumuz var. Biz en azından bireyler olarak bu sorumluluğumuzu yerine getirmemiz lazım. Her neyse yeryüzünü daha temiz tutacak, daha temiz kılacak, daha temiz koruyacak olan biz onu yapmakla sorumluyuz. Yine İslam inancı açısından bir kuralı hatırlatmak istiyorum. Bir geleneksel bir kuralı hatırlatmak istiyorum. Her ne kadar Müslümanların büyük çoğunluğu buna uymasa da der ki bu kuralda bir ırmaktan bile abdest almaktaysan suyu fazla israf etme. Daha fazla tüketim, daha fazla yemek, daha fazla giymek söz gelimi son kertede eğer ötekinin felaketine sebebiyet veriyorsa ben orada kendimi frenlemem lazım. Ama ötekinin rahatsızlığına ve felaketine sebebiyet vermeyecek şekilde sahip olduğum imkanları dilediğim şekilde elbette harcayabilirim. Ama bunun sınırı ötekinin zararıdır. Mutluluğun da sade hayatta olduğuna inananlardanım. Eğer o yol seçilmiş olsa bugün şikayet etmekte olduğumuz bu ozon kirliliğinden vesaireye kadar birçok problemden yakınmayacaktık diye düşünüyorum.
O mundo nunca vai ser melhor. É só você ler a história. O mundo não muda. O mundo não é, o paraíso não é aqui na Terra. Eu não acredito que o mundo vai melhorar. O melhor, impossível inclusive, é só você ler a história da humanidade.
Ich frage mich halt schon, warum
die ganze Menschheitsgeschichte irgendwie, obwohl die Menschen so eine hohe Intelligenz haben, sich diese ganze Geschichte einfach so ein Sumpf ist. Ne? Also warum es halt nicht eine geistige Weiterentwicklung gibt. Es gibt unheimlich viele Errungenschaften und es gibt industrielle Revolutionen und so weiter und es werden Sachen erfunden und es ist alles total irrsinnig, was so abgeht, aber ich habe das Gefühl, dass auf einer sozialen Ebene halt ganz, ganz wenig Entwicklung nur passiert über Jahrtausende und das ist schon so eine Frage, die ich mir immer wieder stelle, wo ich denke, warum entwickelt die Menschheit nicht ein gesundes Verhältnis zu sich selbst und die Menschen untereinander, zueinander, warum gibt es so wenig moralische Verpflichtungen und ja, das frage ich mich, das frage ich die Welt.
Netice itibariyle aynı gezegende yaşıyoruz ve hiçbirimiz diğerinden daha iyi, daha akıllı ya da daha kötü ya da daha inançlı değiliz. Bu gezegende yaşamayı sürdürmek zorundayız. Birbirimize karşı sorumluyuz. Hiçbirimizin ülkesi diğerinden daha üstün, daha iyi değil. Hepsinin iyi, kötü yanları, üstün, alçak yanları var insanoğlu netice itibariyle. Dolayısıyla benim ilk önce iletmek istediğim mesaj, bir, gezegeni yok etmeyelim. İki, niçin bunca insan hala birbirini öldürüyor? Niçin?
I guess my question to the global community really is how can we generate optimism in facing these issues, inspire people to really care and to take it seriously and dedicate themselves more than simply donating to a cause, but really invest in long-term solutions to these injustices that can be solved. And I guess I would be curious to see how other cultures and peoples view these problems, because I think that part of the importance of global civics is bringing different cultures together to get their take on the matter, and I think that this kind of interactive dialogue that's not any one specific government or people working on these issues together is really the fundamental to any progress that we want to make, especially when it's relating to issues of global concern.
The message is we should not take progress for granted. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. Maybe we were a little bit too optimistic. We felt that progress was almost linear. Decolonization, social democracy was built in those years, and we felt that there was no way to stop this. I think things are more difficult. Globalization creates a lot of anxiety and fear. So I think the best message is to continue to be hopeful and courageous, to continue to believe in progress, but at the same time to be very aware of the difficulties and to understand that every day, every week, every month has to be won again. There is no final victory over problems and over violence and conflict. So constant vigilance, but of course in an atmosphere of hope and trust is the best way forward.
I think in the modern world, with all the communications that are available to us on almost a weekly basis, we hear of some horrendous event. More recently, we've heard about not genocide, but still the killing of one's own citizens in Syria. And that very question was debated, and I participated in it at Yale. Some say there's so much that's needed, there's nothing we can do about all the problems in the world. And I simply stress that as an ideal, we have to try and do something, whether it be at Yale or in New York City or in Frankfurt or whatever. We have to try and do something.
And as far as human rights are concerned, I believe that we as a global human community, should be aware and take care of if they are being violated somewhere else, it doesn't matter whether it is our country or another one.
When I hear of genocides and things happening, I feel a very deep heartache, a very deep pain. That's not something I want to lose sight of. That's something I want to bring into living reality for me. That's something I want to not be numbed to. That's the same kind of attitudes that might lead to something like a genocide, maybe there in my own neighborhood, in my own community, and doing what I can to be upright in confronting those and being honest with those.
No, creo que no lo sentiría porque como está el mundo hoy, hay un genocidio o algo terrible en el mundo, no tengo toda la información que creo que llega en base a las experiencias de los últimos años, no permite sacar una conclusión de quién tiene razón, quién no tiene razón. Uno piensa que es un país que tiene razón y después se da cuenta que no era así, entonces no participaría.
这个呢，在佛经上有个比喻，好比一个人发心，发心要把这一块40里的大冰块要融化，他就去烧开水，烧了满满的一大盆开水，然后把这盆开水倒到这个冰块上，效果很明显，马上这个水流过的地方，冰都化掉了。可是过了2个小时，这些冰慢慢又融合了，而且比以前还凸起了一块。那么这个时候，那么这个慈悲心对于融化这个冰是没有力量的，反倒增加了这个冰的厚度。那么这种制止，看你采取的方法，方法很重要。假如你有足够的智慧和慈悲，加上你的方便善巧，那是可以去做的。假如你没有足够的智慧，只有慈悲的话，你去做，可能只会适得其反，就会有可能做一个什么呢？做一个糊涂的好心人。
Bom, o governo de outro país intervir, eu acho que aí já é uma situação delicada, né? Tipo, como é que você vai intervir na casa dos outros? Agora, no caso da ONU, è differente, né? Acho che poderia intervir.
Non c'è dubbio alcuno, ma quello che vorrei che accadesse è che non ci fosse soltanto e solo la mediazione del mio governo, ma che riguardo a questioni come queste fosse davvero la comunità internazionale ad avere l'orientamento, la forza e la capacità di intervenire come tale, perché davvero in questi ambiti affidare tutto ai governi nazionali e alle nazioni si corre il rischio che interessi molto parziali e anche non limpidi possono entrare in gioco.
I think that if I find out that a group of people somewhere is, suffering, or that some horrible thing has happened, and that there's another group of people somewhere else that have the means to remedy that situation, then of course I would want that second group to help the first. I think it becomes a little bit more complicated when you start talking about whether or not different people have the means to remedy those situations, and that it's important from an ethical perspective to sort of consider all of the consequences intended and unintended of intervention. But that being said, that doesn't change the fact that there's sort of this fundamental obligation.
Bueno, como miembro del Parlamento argentino, si mi gobierno se negase a colaborar en ayudas humanitarias, en ayudas contra pueblos que están viviendo genocidios, haría una total y absoluta denuncia e intentaría que el Parlamento argentino votase a favor de ayudas humanitarias en cualquier lugar del mundo.
关于游泳，我游泳，我觉得我游泳。你怎么这样子？一下子就讲。你不行，你调高那个控诉，是吧？你个切反检举，结果还遭报复。
I firmly believe that all these conflicts today, whether we talk about Middle East, Cyprus, Kashmir, you can list them all these can be solved. And I think we have to be much more serious as an international community to solve them, because they tend to create other problems, not necessarily even in the same surroundings, because if people in different parts of the world feel that there's a lot of uneasiness because of these unsolved conflicts, they tend to rebel on other issues, and perhaps even it will inspire also the more extreme elements in society.
如果别的国家发生这人道主义灾难，我觉得中国如果是这种态度的话，就是应该根据实际情况来看。比如说这个人道主义灾难是由于他们自己内部之间的一些这个矛盾所引发的，然后加上有其他国家的一些那个本来对一些各个派别的一种支持啊，或者是或者其他方面的武器啊，或者是道义方面的支持，可能加深了一些这个他们之间本来国家的矛盾。我觉得中国可能在里面可能做点调解工作，没必要做出一些这种实质性的武力干预的措施。当然，这个干预的话还看这个国家的能力，你没这个能力你去干预干什么，是吧？比如美国、欧洲有这个能力，他可能会有这样的去干预。我中国有这样的想法，但是你没这样的能力，你也干预不了。
Mesajım şu olabilir, ötekiyle ilgili ön yargılarından olabildiğince kurtulmaya çalışsınlar. Ötekini keşfetsinler. Ünlü Fransız mütefekkir Jean-Paul Sartre'ın sözünün aksine öteki cehennem değildir. Ötekileştirmektir cehennem. Öteki tam tersine bizim cennetimizdir. Çünkü biz ötekindekini, öteki milletlerdeki, öteki inanç gruplarındaki güzellikleri kendimizle birleştirdiğimiz ölçüde yeryüzünde cenneti yaşarız, cenneti buluruz. Kısacası ötekini tanımaktan korkmasınlar, tam tersine ötekini keşfetmeye çalışsınlar derim diğer milletlere, diğer insanlara.
I think the well-being of human being is clearly better if you have friends, if you don't feel alone in any society. And how developed or less developed the society may be, but that unity that the friendships bring is extremely important. And you feel in any society much better that you don't feel alone. So that's why it's a responsibility for all of us to see that we don't even allow it. If we notice that somebody is, for one reason or another, left outside the circles, then I think we have to extend our hand of friendship to them.
A lot of cars with high beams. Let's try to give them some warning. See if they take the warnings. Nope, they don't take the warnings. My observation is that 80% of drivers that I come across don't switch off their high beams. That's unfair to the pedestrians. They don't know these two drivers are driving blindly. They can't see anything. I cannot see anything. That's why I usually, whenever I can, I don't drive at night. The sky again. Look at the sky. I'm totally blind. I wish those drivers could be more thoughtful. This is pointless. We are risking the lives of each other and the pedestrians without gaining anything. As a nation, we are new into the car culture. As a nation, we are more used to walking, riding a bicycle than sitting behind the wheel. As a nation, we're still not used to the code between drivers, and we're still not used to the potentially destructive power right there in our hands. The same thing can be said about global civics. As humanity, we have never been so globalized. Our lives have never been so connected. As humanity, we still have not realized the potentially destructive power we each have in our individual hands. As humanity, we need time and the will to learn before we pay to a higher price.
Yeah, you know, I think one of the central issues that we're facing today, and issues that increasingly, I think, isn't being asked, and that is a very simple and very fundamental human question, and that is, what does it mean for us as human beings to flourish? Not to flourish in this or that type of activity in which we engage. We ask that question, and we ask it all the time. But what does it mean to flourish for us as human beings? What does it mean to live well as human being? And I think this is one of the central issues that we're facing today, and conversations around this issue. Obviously, many people will give different answers to these questions. Different religions give different answers to this question. But I think it's very important for us to engage in sustained discussion about this issue, because we will not be able to address the burning issues of future unless we have some clarity of what it means to live well, what it means for us as human beings, as individuals, and as communities to flourish. So discuss what it means to flourish as a human being.
Be thoughtful. I think that's the most important thing. I would rather meet in dialogue with someone who I completely disagree with their politics and their philosophy, and I think they're completely wrong on all the policies, but they are approaching the question in a thoughtful way, that they're willing to look at evidence, they're willing to change their mind if they're shown wrong, that they're willing to, think. And I think that's your most important responsibility in the world, is always think.